A routine life shattered by flames. Daryl Jenkins had built his life on routine. At 35, the former firefighter had found solace in the simple, quiet existence he now led in the small town of Riverton. His modest home on the outskirts of town reflected his unassuming personality. A single-story house, painted a faded blue, with a porch that looked out onto a narrow street lined with tall, swaying trees. Every morning, like clockwork, Daryl would wake before sunrise, savor the quiet stillness that accompanied the early hours, and make himself a strong cup of black coffee. Life for Daryl had become an intricate dance of repetition, one he had mastered in his garage. As a mechanic, he was known for his skills, fixing cars with the same precision he once used to save lives. His hands, now covered in oil and grease, had once been responsible for pulling people from burning buildings, for giving families the gift of more time with their loved ones. But that was a different Daryl, a version of himself that he had buried deep inside, a version that had died the same day the fire consumed more than just a building. His garage was a refuge. Cars came in broken, and he sent them out fixed, an order to things he appreciated in a world that felt increasingly chaotic. Most days, the monotony was comforting. He knew what each day would bring, and there was no room for surprises. Daryl valued that predictability because, once upon a time, his life had been filled with uncertainty. The only thing he couldn't fix was his own past. Years before, Daryl had been a firefighter in the bustling city of Fulton, a metropolis 2 hours away from the peaceful quiet of Riverton. He had worn the heavy, flame-resistant jacket with pride, ready to charge into burning buildings without a second thought. Daryl was known for his bravery. He didn't hesitate when lives were at stake, didn't think twice about putting himself in harm's way if it meant pulling someone out of a deadly situation. But that was before the fire, the one that had burned so hot it scorched not just the building but his spirit. It was a day he rarely spoke of, even to those closest to him, though few were left in that category. His brother, Michael, would ask him from time to time, his voice filled with concern and curiosity, but Daryl always deflected. Talking about that day meant confronting not just the fire but the aftermath, the pain, the guilt, the questions that had no answers. So he focused on his garage, on the tangible problems he could solve. That's how he spent most days. Quiet, alone, in the safety of his routine. It was a warm afternoon when everything changed. The sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows as Daryl finished up on a car he had been working on since the early morning. The familiar sound of tires crunching gravel outside his garage signaled that someone had pulled in, though he didn't bother to look up immediately. The quiet town didn't often bring trouble. People came in for repairs, exchanged pleasantries, and then left. Simple. Routine. But today was different. The distinct sound of a car skidding echoed through the air, followed by the unmistakable noise of metal crashing against something solid. Daryl's head jerked up. His heart, dormant for so long, skipped a beat. It wasn't just any car crash. The impact was severe. He dropped his tools, his instincts kicking in before his mind had time to process. Running out of the garage, Daryl's eyes scanned the street. The scene before him was one of chaos. A police car, barely recognizable, had veered off the road and slammed into a tree. Smoke billowed from the crumpled hood, a prelude to what was coming. Flames. It was only a matter of time before the car went up in a blaze, and the clock had already started ticking. Without a second thought, Daryl sprinted toward the wreck. Years of training surged through him, instincts honed from countless emergencies taking control. He didn't see the uniform inside the car. He didn't care who the driver was. All he saw was someone in need of saving, and for the first time in years, Daryl didn't hesitate. As he approached, the smoke thickened, and the heat from the car began to sting his skin. He pulled his shirt over his mouth, trying to shield himself from the toxic fumes. Reaching the driver's side, he could see the officer slumped over, unconscious, trapped by the seatbelt. The man's face was barely visible through the cracked windshield, his body pinned awkwardly between the dashboard and the driver's seat. Daryl's mind raced. The car's engine hissed, warning him that time was running out. With no tools at his disposal, he yanked at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Cursing under his breath, he ran to the other side, trying the passenger door. It opened with a groan, the metal scraping against the crumpled body of the car. "Hang in there, man," Daryl muttered as he crawled inside, barely fitting through the opening. The officer's face was pale, blood trickling down from a cut on his forehead. Daryl reached for the seatbelt, fumbling with the buckle. It was jammed. Of course it was. Nothing was ever simple in a situation like this. The heat intensified, the flames licking the front of the car. Daryl's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm. He needed leverage. Pushing himself back out of the passenger side, he grabbed a crowbar from his garage. Running back, he jammed it into the door's frame, using every ounce of strength to pry it open. Metal screeched, and with a final tug, the door gave way. He was in. Daryl pulled the seatbelt free and began dragging the officer out, every second feeling like an eternity. As he pulled the man's body free of the wreckage, the flames engulfed the front of the car, roaring to life as if angry they had lost their prey. Without looking back, Daryl hauled the officer a safe distance away before collapsing beside him, his chest heaving from the effort. He checked the man's pulse. It was weak, but it was there. The sound of sirens filled the air, but Daryl barely registered them. His hands trembled as the adrenaline began to wear off. He had done it. He had saved a life again, for the first time in years. But as the paramedics rushed over and police cars surrounded the scene, a sinking feeling settled in his stomach. This was no ordinary rescue. The man he had saved was Officer Bradley, one of the most well-known cops in town, a white officer with a history of strained relations with the black community. The town had a complicated relationship with its law enforcement, and Daryl had just inserted himself into the middle of it. As he stood there, watching the scene unfold, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a dramatic turn. Saving Officer Bradley had been the easy part. What came next, however, would test Daryl in ways he never imagined. The flames had been extinguished, but the firestorm was only beginning. The ripples of heroism. Daryl's heart raced as the distant sirens grew louder, their high-pitched wail cutting through the once peaceful air of Riverton. The flames still hissed behind him as firefighters doused what was left of the police car, but he was only half aware of the commotion around him. His focus was on the man he had just pulled from the wreckage, Officer Bradley. Lying unconscious on the ground, Officer Bradley was a stark contrast to the person Daryl had always imagined him to be. Riverton wasn't the kind of place where dramatic rescues happened every day, and Bradley, with his stern demeanor and imposing presence, had always seemed invincible. But now, looking at the man sprawled out on the pavement, pale and broken, he seemed like nothing more than just another human in need of help. Paramedics arrived on the scene, swiftly taking over where Daryl had left off. One of them, a young woman with dark hair tied back in a ponytail, gave Daryl a quick nod of acknowledgement as she began assessing the officer's injuries. "Thanks for what you did," she said, her voice laced with urgency but tinged with gratitude. "He wouldn't have made it without you." Daryl, still panting from the effort, simply nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. He had heard similar words before, back when he wore the firefighter's uniform, back when saving lives was second nature to him. But this was different. This time, it wasn't just about pulling someone from the flames. It was about the ramifications of what had just happened. He watched as the paramedics loaded Officer Bradley into the ambulance, his limp body disappearing into the back of the vehicle. Daryl felt a strange pang of responsibility. As the ambulance sped away, he stood there, staring at the empty space it had left behind, the weight of the moments settling heavily on his shoulders. News traveled fast in small towns, and Riverton was no exception. By the time Daryl returned to his garage, the whispers had already started. He could feel it in the way people looked at him as he walked through town, glances that were a mixture of awe and curiosity, but also something else, something darker. He wasn't a stranger to this kind of attention, but it still made him uneasy. The garage, his sanctuary, was no longer quiet. As soon as he walked through the door, the phone rang. It hadn't stopped ringing since the accident. Customers, friends, even a few reporters, all wanting to know the details of the heroic rescue. Daryl ignored the calls. He didn't have the energy for it. Instead, he sat down at his workbench, his hands trembling as he absent-mindedly fiddled with a wrench. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving him with a hollow sense of unease. It wasn't long before Michael, his younger brother, showed up. Michael was everything Daryl wasn't: charismatic, loud, and always the life of the party. The two brothers had always been close, but they couldn't have been more different. While Daryl had retreated into the quiet life after leaving the fire department, Michael had embraced the hustle and bustle of city life, working as a lawyer in Fulton. Still, he never missed an opportunity to check in on his older brother, especially when something big happened. "I saw the news, man," Michael said, walking into the garage with wide eyes, his voice full of disbelief. "You saved a cop, and not just any cop. Bradley." Daryl let out a slow breath. "Yeah," he muttered, not looking up from the wrench in his hands. "It just happened." Michael laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that came from amusement. It was more incredulous, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Of all people, you really stepped into it this time." "Huh." Daryl shot him a look. "I wasn't thinking about who he was. I just saw someone in trouble." Michael leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "I get that, but you know what this means, right? The whole town's talking about it. You saved Bradley, the Sangaiwo." "I know who he is," Daryl interrupted, his voice sharper than he intended. He didn't need reminding of Bradley's history with the black community. Riverton might have been a small town, but it wasn't without its share of tensions. And Bradley, for better or worse, had been at the center of more than one incident that had drawn criticism. He was known for his rigid adherence to the rules, but also for a few questionable stops and arrests, most of which seemed to disproportionately affect black residents. "Look, I'm just saying," Michael continued, lowering his voice, "there's going to be fallout from this. You might want to be ready." Daryl sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I didn't do it for him. I did it because it's what I had to do." Michael nodded, his expression softening. "I know, but not everyone's going to see it that way." Daryl tried to push the thoughts of the accident to the back of his mind, but it was no use. That night, as he lay in bed, the image of Officer Bradley's bloodied face kept flashing before him. He had saved a man's life, but instead of feeling pride, there was only a gnawing sense of dread. He couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming, something he couldn't control. The next morning, his fears were confirmed. As he walked into the garage, he was greeted by a crowd: reporters, photographers, even a few locals who had caught wind of the event. They stood outside the garage, their cameras flashing, their voices shouting questions at him before he even had a chance to open the door. "Daryl Jenkins, can you tell us what happened during the rescue? Daryl, how do you feel about saving Officer Bradley? Do you think this changes things between the black community and the police?" The questions came fast, each one blending into the next. Daryl's mind raced. He hadn't expected this kind of attention. He wasn't the kind of man who wanted to be in the spotlight. All he wanted was to fix cars, keep his head down, and live his quiet life. But now it seemed that life was slipping further and further away. He pushed through the crowd, ignoring the barrage of questions, and slammed the door of the garage behind him. His hands trembled as he reached for the lock, twisting it in place as if that could somehow keep the world out. But it didn't. The phone rang again. This time, Daryl answered. "Jenkins Auto," he said, his voice gruff. "Mr. Jenkins." The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, smooth and professional. "This is Lieutenant Hart from the Riverton Police Department. I just wanted to thank you for what you did yesterday." Darrell tensed. He had been expecting this call, but now that it had come, he wasn't sure how to respond. "I was just doing what anyone would do," he replied. "I doubt that," Lieutenant Hart said, his tone almost amused. "Officer Bradley is recovering at the hospital, and I'm sure he'll want to thank you personally when he's able, but I wanted to talk to you about something else." Darrell's grip on the phone tightened. "What's that?" "We'd like to honor you," Hart continued. "The department wants to hold a ceremony in your honor. The mayor's on board, and we think it could be a great way to show unity in the community." Darrell's stomach churned. A ceremony. Public recognition. That was the last thing he wanted. He could already feel the tension bubbling beneath the surface. A black man saving a white cop in a town with a history of racial strife wasn't just a story of heroism. It was a powder keg waiting to explode. "I'm not sure that's necessary," Darrell said slowly, trying to find the right words. "I think it is," Hart replied, his voice firm. This could be a big moment for Riverton. A big moment, that's what they wanted. But Darrell wasn't so sure he was ready for it. "I'll think about it," Darrell muttered before hanging up the phone. As the silence filled the garage once more, Darrell knew that his life had changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. What had started as a simple act of heroism was now spiraling into something far more complex. He had saved a life, but now he would have to face the consequences of that action. And the town of Riverton was watching his every move. A town divided. In the days following the accident, Riverton buzzed with a strange, electric tension. It was a town that had once prided itself on its small-town charm, its sense of community, but now that veneer seemed to be cracking. Darrell's act of heroism had ignited a conversation that had long been simmering beneath the surface, one that had little to do with the flames that consumed Officer Bradley's car. On one side, there were those who saw Darrell as a hero, a beacon of hope in a town that had grown tired of the divisive narratives that separated black and white. They applauded his courage, praised his selflessness, and insisted that this was the beginning of something new, something better for Riverton. On the other side, however, was a growing skepticism. Some whispered that Darrell had only acted out of self-interest, that his rescue of Bradley was more about gaining attention than anything else. Others viewed it through a different lens. A black man saving a white cop, in a town with a fraught racial history, wasn't seen as purely heroic. It was seen as complicated, layered with symbolism that made some people uneasy. Riverton had a past, and no one knew that better than Darrell. The town's racial history was one filled with quiet tensions, unspoken rules, and the kind of invisible lines that everyone pretended didn't exist, but knew to never cross. Officer Bradley had been at the center of several controversies, particularly involving young black men, and his reputation among the black community was far from stellar. Darrell, by saving him, had waded into waters that were far deeper than he had anticipated. Darrell kept to himself as much as he could, but there was no escaping the growing attention. Every time he stepped outside his garage, someone was there. Reporters, townsfolk, even the occasional stranger who had heard the story, and come to see the man at the center of it all. It was exhausting. Michael, ever the pragmatist, had offered to help him handle the situation, but Darrell had refused. He didn't need his brother's lawyerly advice, not yet. He just wanted to be left alone, but the town wouldn't let him. One afternoon, about a week after the accident, Darrell was working on an old pickup truck, the rhythmic sound of his wrench-twisting bolts the only thing grounding him in the present. The sound of the garage door creaking open startled him. "Darrell, you got a minute?" It was Reverend Thomas, the pastor of Riverton's largest black church, and a man Darrell had known for most of his life. The Reverend was a tall, imposing figure with a deep, rumbling voice that could fill a room without effort. He rarely visited Darrell's garage, which made this moment feel all the more significant. Darrell straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Afternoon, Reverend. What brings you by?" The Reverend stepped inside, his expression serious but kind. I came to talk, son. There's a lot going on, and I figured you could use a friend to help you navigate it. Darrell raised an eyebrow, unsure of where this conversation was headed. He respected Reverend Thomas, but he wasn't in the mood for a sermon. Still, he nodded, motioning for the older man to take a seat on the bench by the wall. Reverend Thomas sat down slowly, his eyes never leaving Darrell. You did a good thing, Darrell. A brave thing. But I know you're feeling the weight of it now. You've stirred something in this town, and people are going to react in all kinds of ways. Darrell leaned against the truck, crossing his arms. I wasn't trying to stir anything, Reverend. I just did what I thought was right. I know you did, but sometimes doing the right thing doesn't come with a reward, does it? Sometimes it brings trouble, and from what I've been hearing, trouble's coming your way. Darrell frowned. What kind of trouble? The Reverend let out a slow breath. The black community's divided on what you did, Darrell. There are some folks who think you're a hero, sure. But others, well, they're not so sure. Officer Bradley's got a history, and not a good one. You saving him. It's complicated. Some people feel like you've betrayed the community, like you've put him in a position to be seen as the victim, when he's been anything but. Darrell felt a surge of frustration rising within him. He had anticipated some mixed reactions, but the idea that people in his own community might see his actions as a betrayal hit him harder than he expected. Are you saying I shouldn't have saved him? Darrell asked, his voice tight. Reverend Thomas shook his head. No, son. I'm not saying that at all. What you did was right, but you have to understand, not everyone sees it that way. There's a lot of pain in this town, a lot of history that doesn't just disappear because of one act of heroism. Folks are hurting, and when they're hurting, they look for someone to blame. Darrell rubbed the back of his neck, the weight of the Reverend's words settling over him like a heavy blanket. He had never thought of himself as someone important enough to influence the town, but now it seemed like his actions were being scrutinized in ways he couldn't control. I didn't ask for any of this, Darrell said quietly. I saw someone who needed help. I didn't think about the rest of it. Reverend Thomas nodded. And that's exactly why you're a good man, Darrell. But good men sometimes get caught in the middle of things bigger than themselves. There was a long pause between them. The sound of the clock ticking on the wall filled the silence. Darrell, the police department wants to hold a ceremony for you, the Reverend said, breaking the quiet. I heard about it through the grapevine. They want to make a big deal out of this, make it a show of unity. And the mayor's all for it. But you need to ask yourself, is that what you want? Because once you step onto that stage, you're not just Darrell Jenkins the mechanic anymore. You'll be something else. A symbol. Darrell stared at the floor, the weight of the Reverend's words sinking in. A symbol. He had never wanted that. He didn't want to be the face of some campaign for unity, nor did he want to be the person people pointed to when talking about the town's divisions. He just wanted to live his life, quietly and without attention. I don't want to be a symbol, Darrell muttered. I just want things to go back to normal. The Reverend smiled softly, his eyes filled with understanding. I know, but sometimes life doesn't let you go back to normal. Sometimes you're put in a position where you have to step forward, whether you want to or not. The next few days were a blur of conflicting emotions for Darrell. He kept his head down, avoiding the reporters, avoiding the town's gossip, but no matter how hard he tried, the attention followed him. People would stop by the garage, not for car repairs, but to talk about the accident, about Bradley, about what Darrell's actions meant for the town. One evening, after closing the garage early, Darrell decided to walk through town, hoping that the fresh air would clear his mind. The streets were quieter than usual, the autumn sun beginning to set, casting long shadows across the pavement. As he walked, he noticed something that hadn't been there before. In the town square, a large banner had been hung from the city hall, boldly proclaiming, "Celebrating our hero, Darrell Jenkins." His stomach churned at the sight. He stood there, staring at the banner, a mix of disbelief and anger rising in his chest. This wasn't what he wanted. He didn't want to be celebrated, didn't want to be paraded in front of the town like some kind of trophy. His act of saving Bradley had been personal, something he had done because it was the right thing to do, not because he wanted praise or recognition. But now it seemed like the town was intent on turning him into something he wasn't. As he stood there, lost in thought, a voice broke through the silence. "Daryl?" He turned to see Claire, a local journalist and someone he had known for years. She approached him cautiously, her camera hanging from her neck. Claire was one of the few reporters who hadn't bombarded him with questions over the past week. She had always been fair, never one to sensationalize a story. "Claire," he said, his voice weary, "what are you doing here?" She shrugged, glancing up at the banner. "I've been following the story, like everyone else. But I'm not here for that. I just wanted to check on you. I know this can't be easy." Daryl let out a bitter laugh. "That's an understatement." Claire smiled softly. "I can imagine. I've been writing about this town for a long time, and I'd never seen anything like this. You're in the middle of a storm, Daryl." "I didn't ask for this," he said, shaking his head. "I don't want to be anyone's hero." "I know," Claire replied, her voice gentle. "But you are, whether you like it or not. The question is, what are you going to do with it?" Daryl stared at the banner again, the weight of her question settling over him. What was he going to do? The weight of recognition. As days turned into weeks, Daryl found himself grappling with the ramifications of his actions. The banner celebrating him as a hero hung like a dark cloud over his life. He was no longer just a mechanic. He had become a symbol of hope and change in Riverton. The reality weighed heavily on him, transforming the life he had always known into something unrecognizable. The town square had become a gathering place, where people came to talk about him, to express their opinions about his rescue of Officer Bradley. While many praised his bravery, others whispered doubts and accusations, questioning his motives and character. Daryl felt the scrutiny in the air, like a palpable force pressing down on him. He continued to avoid the media, but their presence was unavoidable. Reporters flocked to Riverton, eager to capture the heroic mechanic on camera. Even his own brother Michael, who had initially supported Daryl, was now inundated with questions about Daryl's intentions and the potential ramifications of his actions. Daryl could sense that Michael was trying to protect him, but Daryl could also feel the pressure mounting. One evening, after another long day in the garage, Daryl returned home, exhausted. He was still processing the emotional turmoil of the past few weeks when he noticed a stack of letters on his kitchen table. They were from people he didn't know, some local, some from far away, each one expressing gratitude, admiration, or support. But the one that caught his attention was a small envelope with no return address. Curious, he opened it, revealing a handwritten note inside. "Dear Daryl, I just wanted to say thank you for what you did for Officer Bradley. I know it's not easy being in the spotlight, but you did something extraordinary. You showed us that heroism knows no color. Please remember, there are many of us who appreciate what you did and are rooting for you. Sincerely, a friend." Daryl felt a warmth wash over him. It was a simple gesture, but it reminded him that not everyone viewed his actions through a lens of skepticism. There were people who saw him for what he truly was, a man who acted in a moment of crisis, not a figurehead or a symbol. Despite the positive feedback, the shadows of doubt still loomed large. The planned ceremony to honor him was just days away, and Daryl found himself plagued with anxiety. Would it be a celebration of unity, or would it only serve to amplify the divisions that had long existed in Riverton? He wrestled with whether he should attend or simply avoid the spotlight altogether. It was a late afternoon when he decided to visit Reverend Thomas, hoping the pastor could provide some clarity. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden light over the church as he approached the entrance. Daryl took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his uncertainty as he stepped inside. "Reverend, I need to talk," he said, his voice heavy with concern. Reverend Thomas looked up from where he was organizing some papers. His brow furrowed slightly as he gestured for Daryl to take a seat. "What's on your mind, son?" Daryl took a moment to gather his thoughts. "This ceremony. I don't know if I can go through with it. I feel like I'm being paraded around like some trophy. It's not what I wanted." The Reverend nodded slowly, understanding the depth of Daryl's feelings. "It's a lot to carry, Daryl. I understand your hesitation. But think about this. You didn't choose to be a hero, but now that you are, you have the chance to influence the conversation in Riverton. You can be a voice for change, a catalyst for healing. But what if it backfires?" Daryl shot back, his frustration spilling over. "What if I become a target instead of a bridge? I don't want to stir up any more division. I just wanted to help someone in need." Reverend Thomas leaned back, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "You may not have chosen this path, but the fact remains that you're on it. The ceremony is more than just about you. It's about how we can all come together as a community. You can use this moment to address the very real issues that divide us." Daryl stared at the floor, his mind racing. "You really think it can make a difference?" The Reverend's eyes shone with conviction. "Absolutely. Sometimes it takes one person to step into the fire and show the rest of us how to put it out. You may not see it yet, but your act has ignited a conversation that needs to happen." In the days leading up to the ceremony, Daryl spent sleepless nights weighing the pros and cons of his decision. Each morning, he found himself staring at the mirror, searching for the man he used to be, but all he saw was a face strained with worry and uncertainty. He needed to make a choice, to embrace the role he had unintentionally been thrust into or to walk away from it all. On the morning of the ceremony, Daryl woke early. The air was crisp, and the sun peeked through the clouds, casting a gentle glow over the town. As he dressed, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had spent years living a quiet, predictable life, and now he stood on the cusp of something profound. Arriving at the town square, he felt the palpable energy in the air. Crowds were gathering, excited chatter filling the space. The local news stations had set up cameras, and the stage was adorned with flowers and banners. Daryl's heart raced. This was no longer just about him. It was a significant moment for Riverton, a crossroads for the community. As he walked toward the stage, he felt the eyes of the crowd upon him. Some faces beamed with admiration, while others were skeptical, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and resentment. Daryl took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He was here to deliver a message, not just for himself, but for everyone in Riverton. As the ceremony began, Mayor Collins stepped up to the microphone, his voice booming across the square. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we honor a remarkable individual, Daryl Jenkins. He has shown us what it means to be courageous, to be compassionate, and to rise above fear in the face of adversity." The crowd erupted in applause, but Daryl could feel a knot forming in his stomach. He was there, but not for the accolades or the applause. He was there for something deeper, something more meaningful. After several speeches, it was finally Daryl's turn to speak. As he approached the microphone, the applause faded into an anticipatory silence. He looked out over the crowd, taking in the faces, friends, neighbors, even strangers, and felt a swell of emotions rise within him. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady yet laced with vulnerability. "I stand here today not as a hero, but as a man who saw someone in need and acted. But the truth is, it's complicated. My actions may have saved Officer Bradley's life, but they also opened a conversation that many of us have been avoiding for too long." He paused, glancing around to gauge the reactions. He could see people nodding, leaning in, their interest piqued. In Riverton, we have a history that's not always easy to talk about. There's pain, misunderstanding, and division among us. Officer Bradley has made mistakes, and those mistakes have impacted lives. But I believe that if we're going to heal, we need to face those issues together. We need to have honest conversations, listen to each other, and work toward understanding. Daryl's heart raced as he spoke. "I didn't save Officer Bradley for him to be a hero. I did it because he was a man in trouble, and I believe that we can all be better. We need to recognize that heroism doesn't come from saving someone only when it's convenient. It comes from being there, even when it's uncomfortable. As he continued, Daryl felt a shift in the crowd. Whispers turned to nods of agreement. He spoke from the heart, his voice rising with passion and conviction. If we want change in this town, we must be willing to step outside our comfort zones. We must confront our biases, acknowledge our fears, and strive for unity, not division. This isn't just my journey, it's ours. As he concluded his speech, Daryl felt lighter, as if he had finally unburdened himself of the weight he had been carrying. The crowd erupted into applause, but it felt different this time. It was no longer just a response to his actions. It was an acknowledgement of the message he had shared. After the ceremony, Daryl was approached by many members of the community. Some offered congratulations, while others engaged him in deep discussions about race, police relations, and the future of Riverton. He could see a change in the atmosphere, a willingness to talk, to confront the complexities of their shared reality. Later that evening, as Daryl walked home, he felt a sense of hope he hadn't experienced in a long time. Maybe he hadn't just acted as a hero, but had sparked something greater within the town. Perhaps his simple act of bravery could lead to deeper conversations and ultimately foster a greater understanding among the residents of Riverton. In the weeks that followed, Daryl continued to engage with the community, participating in discussions, town hall meetings, and workshops aimed at bridging the divides that had long existed. With Reverend Thomas's guidance, he even started a community outreach program, focusing on building relationships between the police and the Black community. Daryl was determined to ensure that his story didn't end with a single act of heroism, but evolved into a movement for change and healing. He realized that true heroism was not just in the act of saving someone's life, but in the commitment to nurturing a community that embraced its differences and worked towards a common goal. The transformation in Daryl's life was remarkable. No longer just a mechanic, he had become a leader in the community, using his voice to advocate for change and inspire others. The conversations he started were uncomfortable at times, but they were necessary. He had stepped into the fire, not just to save one life, but to ignite a spark of hope in the hearts of many. And while the road ahead would be filled with challenges, Daryl was no longer alone. He was part of a movement, a community coming together to create a better future for Riverton. The tides of change. As the weeks turned into months, Daryl found himself at the heart of a growing movement in Riverton. What began as a solitary act of bravery had blossomed into a community initiative that aimed to heal the town's deep-seated divisions. The outreach program he initiated, Bridges of Hope, quickly gained momentum, drawing in residents from all walks of life, young and old, Black and white, conservative and liberal. Daryl had learned early on that effective change required not just dialogue but action. With Reverend Thomas and Michael by his side, he organized workshops, community discussions, and even joint activities between local police officers and the residents. They held barbecues in the park, sports events, and open forums where people could share their stories, their fears, and their hopes. They created a space for understanding, a rare opportunity for honest communication. But while the movement began to grow, Daryl also faced challenges. Not everyone was on board with the changes. Some residents resisted the conversations about race and police relations, believing it was unnecessary to dwell on the past. Others viewed Daryl's efforts as an attempt to shift the balance of power in the town, feeling threatened by the prospect of open dialogue and accountability. Daryl felt the tension rising, particularly after one heated community meeting. They had gathered at the local community center, the air thick with anticipation. Chairs filled quickly as residents took their places, some eager to engage, others ready to confront. Daryl could sense the unease in the room. As the meeting progressed, a woman named Carol, known for her outspoken views, stood up. She was an older white resident, and her voice cut through the murmurs. "This is ridiculous. Why do we need to talk about race? It's not a problem here. We're all friends. Why make it awkward? Daryl took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Carol, I appreciate your perspective, but I think it's important to acknowledge that, while we may consider ourselves friends, there are still underlying issues that affect our community. Ignoring them won't make them go away. Carol's eyes narrowed, and the tension in the room became palpable. You think you're some kind of hero now, but all you're doing is stirring the pot. We don't need any of this. Maybe we don't need to stir the pot, Daryl replied, his voice steady. But we do need to heat it up. Change isn't comfortable, and it won't happen if we don't confront the issues at hand. The conversation escalated, with voices rising and emotions flaring. Daryl could feel the divide growing, the resistance from those who wanted to maintain the status quo. After the meeting, he sat with Reverend Thomas and Michael, both of whom looked weary. This is harder than I thought it would be, Daryl admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. I just wanted to bring us together, but it feels like I'm creating more conflict. Reverend Thomas placed a hand on Daryl's shoulder. Change is never easy, Daryl. The fact that you're willing to engage with these difficult conversations is a testament to your courage. We're making progress, even if it feels like we're taking 2 steps back for every step forward. Michael nodded in agreement. You can't expect everyone to embrace this immediately. Change takes time, and some people will resist until the very end. Just keep pushing forward. Your voice matters, and so does your heart. That night, Daryl lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Despite the struggles, he remained resolute in his mission. He refused to let the opposition discourage him. He had seen firsthand the potential for connection, for understanding, and he was determined to keep going. As the winter months approached, the spirit of the community began to shift. The Bridges of Hope program continued to grow, and with it, a renewed sense of camaraderie began to emerge. The community organized a Unity Day, an event designed to celebrate diversity while promoting understanding and collaboration. The idea was simple: bring everyone together for a day of fun, food, and fellowship. As the date approached, Daryl and his team worked tirelessly to prepare. They reached out to local businesses for sponsorships and donations, organized games and activities, and set up booths where community members could share their stories and experiences. The excitement in the air was palpable as they promoted the event across town. The day of the Unity Day arrived, and the sun shone brightly in the clear blue sky. Daryl arrived early, setting up alongside volunteers who had shown up to help. The park was alive with activity as families began to gather, and the smell of grilled burgers and hot dogs wafted through the air. Daryl felt a wave of hope wash over him. This was what he had envisioned, a community coming together. As people arrived, he saw familiar faces and new ones alike. Officer Bradley, who had been actively involved in the outreach program since the accident, was there, chatting with kids and flipping burgers on the grill. Daryl felt a mix of gratitude and apprehension. Bradley had become a key player in the effort, but their relationship remained complex. "Hey, Daryl," Bradley called, a smile on his face. "You ready for this?" Daryl returned the smile, though it felt tentative. "I guess so. Just hoping for a good turnout." "You've done a lot for this town," Bradley said, sincerity in his voice. "People are starting to listen." As the afternoon progressed, laughter and chatter filled the park. Daryl moved from group to group, engaging with everyone he could. He listened to stories of struggles, triumphs, and dreams, conversations that were both enlightening and humbling. The walls between residents began to crumble, replaced by genuine connections. At one point, Daryl noticed Carol standing off to the side, arms crossed, watching the festivities with a skeptical expression. He decided to approach her, determined to bridge the gap. "Hey, Carol, how's it going?" She looked surprised but didn't back down. "I just don't see the point in all this," she replied, gesturing to the crowd. "It feels forced." "Why do you think that?" Daryl asked, genuinely curious. "What's bothering you?" Carol sighed, her posture softening slightly. I just don't understand why we need to make such a big deal about race. We're all here together, aren't we?" Daryl took a moment to consider her words. "We are. But sometimes we need to acknowledge our differences to appreciate our similarities. It's not about blaming anyone. It's about understanding each other. This day is a step in that direction." She remained silent for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Daryl could sense the internal struggle within her. "Maybe I just don't want to feel like I have to apologize for things I didn't do," she finally said, her voice quiet. Daryl nodded, understanding where she was coming from. "I get that. But this isn't about blame. It's about creating a space where we can all learn from one another. That's how we build a better community." Carol hesitated but then nodded slowly. "Maybe you're right. I just don't want to feel like I have to change who I am." "No one's asking you to change," Daryl reassured her. "Just to be open to the idea that our experiences shape us, and those experiences can help us grow. I'm glad you're here." As they stood together, watching the crowd, Daryl felt a sense of hope. This conversation might not change everything, but it was a start. Perhaps if they could find common ground, others could too. Later in the afternoon, as the festivities continued, Daryl took the stage to address the crowd. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the park, and he felt a sense of anticipation building within him. He wanted to capture the essence of what Unity Day represented: collaboration, understanding, and hope. "Thank you all for being here today," Daryl began, his voice steady. "Today isn't just about celebrating our differences. It's about recognizing that we are stronger together. We've faced challenges, and we've had our disagreements, but today we stand united." The crowd cheered, and Daryl felt a surge of energy. He continued, "The journey toward understanding isn't easy. It requires patience, compassion, and the willingness to listen. We all have stories, and it's those stories that can help us find common ground." He paused, scanning the audience. "I believe that each of us has the power to make a difference, not just in our own lives, but in the lives of others. It's time to be the change we want to see in our community. Together, we can create a Riverton that is welcoming to everyone, where every voice is heard and every person is valued." As he spoke, he noticed that even Carol was nodding, a look of contemplation on her face. "Let's continue these conversations," Daryl urged. "Let's share our experiences, listen to each other, and work together toward healing. We are not just neighbors. We are a community. And together, we can create a brighter future." The crowd erupted into applause, and Daryl felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He had always dreamed of a community where people could connect, but now he was witnessing it unfold before his eyes. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the energy of the day lingered in the air. Daryl stood at the edge of the park, watching families pack up their picnic blankets, laughter and chatter echoing around him. The day had been a success, far beyond what he had anticipated. He felt grateful, energized, and hopeful. As he turned to leave, he noticed a group of young adults gathered around Officer Bradley. They were engaged in a lively discussion, and Daryl felt a sense of satisfaction. The lines of communication were opening. Barriers were being dismantled. Just as he was about to head home, Reverend Thomas approached him, a broad smile on his face. "Daryl, you did it. You've started something truly special here. The town needed this." Daryl smiled back, feeling a swell of pride. "We've all done it, Reverend. It's a team effort. But I know there's still so much work to do." "Indeed, there is," Reverend Thomas agreed. "But today was a major step forward. Remember, change takes time. Keep leading with your heart, and you'll inspire others." As they walked toward the parking lot, Daryl felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had taken risks, faced challenges, and stood up for what he believed in. And while the road ahead would undoubtedly be difficult, he was no longer afraid. He had discovered his voice, his mission, and a community willing to listen. The following weeks were filled with planning and implementing the next steps for the Bridges of Hope initiative. They organized follow-up meetings, focusing on specific topics such as education, mentorship, and community safety. The feedback from Unity Day had been overwhelmingly positive, and Daryl felt the momentum building. However, there were still challenges ahead. As the discussions deepened, the resistance from certain factions of the community became more pronounced. Some felt threatened by the prospect of change, fearing they would lose their position or privilege. Daryl was prepared for this backlash, but knew he had to approach it with care. One evening, he received a call from Michael, who sounded anxious. "Daryl, I've heard some unsettling things. Some people are upset about what you're trying to do. They're saying you're trying to change everything." Daryl sighed, feeling the weight of responsibility. "I'm not trying to change everything, Mike. I'm just trying to open a dialogue. People are afraid of what they don't understand." "I get that," Michael replied. "But you need to be careful. They might try to undermine what you're doing. We can't afford to lose this momentum." Daryl nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I appreciate your concern, but I can't back down. If we don't address these issues head-on, they'll fester and grow. We have to keep pushing forward, even if it's uncomfortable." The conversation left Daryl feeling conflicted. He was passionate about the work he was doing, but he also understood the fear and resistance that change could evoke. He knew he had to be strategic, but he refused to shy away from the difficult conversations that lay ahead. As the months rolled on, Daryl and his team pressed forward. They scheduled town hall meetings to address specific community concerns, inviting local leaders, educators, and even members of law enforcement to speak. Daryl felt a mix of anticipation and apprehension with each gathering, hoping for progress but bracing for backlash. One of the most significant meetings was scheduled for a Tuesday evening at the community center. Daryl knew this was a crucial opportunity to address the growing concerns and engage the community in a meaningful dialogue. He prepared diligently, gathering facts, statistics, and stories that illustrated the need for change. The evening arrived, and the room quickly filled with residents. Daryl looked around, spotting familiar faces as well as those who had been critical of his efforts. He could feel the tension in the air, a mix of curiosity and skepticism. As he took the stage, he felt the weight of the moment. "Thank you all for coming tonight. I know that this is a challenging time for our community, and I appreciate your willingness to engage in this dialogue." Daryl shared data on the disparities that existed in Riverton, the challenges that marginalized communities faced, and the importance of creating a safe environment for everyone. He emphasized the need for collaboration and understanding, aiming to foster a sense of unity rather than division. As he spoke, he noticed several people nodding, their expressions shifting from skepticism to contemplation. But there were still voices of dissent. "Why should we care about these issues? We've never had a problem in our town," a man shouted from the back, crossing his arms defiantly. Daryl took a deep breath, maintaining his composure. "That's a valid concern, but just because you haven't personally experienced these issues doesn't mean they don't exist. Acknowledging them is the first step toward addressing them." Another voice piped up. "But why change things if we're doing just fine?" "Because doing fine isn't enough," Daryl responded, his voice rising with passion. "We need to strive for better, for all of us. Imagine a Riverton where every person feels safe and valued, where our children can grow up in a community that supports them. That's the kind of town we should be working toward." The dialogue continued, with tensions flaring and voices clashing. But as the night wore on, Daryl could sense a shift. More residents began to engage in constructive conversations, sharing their own experiences and perspectives. The walls of resistance started to crumble, even if just a little. By the end of the night, Daryl felt exhausted but encouraged. He realized that while change was slow, it was happening. People were willing to listen, to engage, and to challenge their own beliefs. He left the community center that night with a sense of hope, knowing that they were all part of a larger movement toward understanding and change. In the months that followed, Daryl's life became a whirlwind of activity. He was invited to speak at various events, from schools to local organizations, sharing his story and advocating for change. The momentum continued to build as more residents joined the Bridges of Hope initiative, eager to make a difference. However, with the increased visibility came challenges. Daryl began receiving anonymous letters and messages online, some laced with hate, questioning his motives and accusing him of trying to stir the pot. Initially, he felt disheartened, but with each negative comment, he grew more determined. One day, as he was sorting through the mail at the garage, he opened another anonymous letter. It was filled with derogatory comments, attacking his character and questioning his commitment to the community. Daryl felt the sting of the words, but he also recognized the fear and misunderstanding behind them. Instead of allowing the negativity to consume him, Daryl decided to use it as fuel for his mission. He gathered his team and organized a community meeting focused on addressing misconceptions and fears surrounding the Bridges of Hope initiative. "Let's invite people in," he said, determination shining in his eyes. "Let's create a space where we can discuss these concerns openly, where we can clarify our intentions and show that we're here to build, not to destroy." The meeting was scheduled for the following week, and Daryl spent the days leading up to it preparing. He wanted to ensure that everyone felt heard, including those who opposed the initiative. He believed that only through dialogue could they bridge the gaps in understanding. On the night of the meeting, the community center was packed. Daryl looked around the room, seeing a mix of supporters and skeptics, and felt a knot form in his stomach. He understood the importance of the evening. It could either strengthen the movement or push people further apart. As the meeting commenced, Daryl welcomed everyone, acknowledging the mixed emotions in the room. "Thank you for being here tonight. I know there are concerns about our initiative, and I want to create a space where we can have honest conversations." Daryl began by sharing his own story, emphasizing that he was just a man who had acted in a moment of crisis. "I didn't set out to be a leader. I didn't want to be a hero. But I realized that we all have a role to play in making Riverton a better place." As he spoke, he saw nods of agreement and expressions of concern. "I know there are fears about change. It's uncomfortable, and it can feel threatening. But change doesn't have to be scary. It can be an opportunity for growth and connection." The first hand went up. A young woman named. As the night progressed, more voices chimed in. They discussed their fears, their experiences, and their hopes for the future. Daryl felt a shift in the room, a willingness to engage rather than oppose. It was as if a bridge was slowly being constructed, connecting people who had previously felt isolated. By the end of the meeting, Daryl felt a sense of accomplishment. They hadn't solved all their problems, but they had taken a significant step toward understanding. People began to mingle afterward, discussing their thoughts and experiences, and Daryl realized that they were starting to connect on a deeper level. Weeks passed, and the Bridges of Hope initiative continued to flourish. More community members became involved, creating committees focused on education, mentorship, and outreach. Daryl felt a sense of pride watching his vision unfold, knowing that they were making a difference together. However, he was also aware of the challenges that lay ahead. As the movement gained traction, tensions flared in other parts of the country, and the national discourse around race and policing intensified. Daryl often found himself reflecting on the impact this would have on Riverton. One evening, as he sat at his kitchen table, he couldn't shake the feeling that they needed to take a stand. "We can't just be silent," he thought. "We have to be part of the conversation." Daryl decided to host a town hall specifically focused on the broader issues facing communities across the nation. He believed it was essential to connect local conversations to the national narrative, to show that Riverton was not an isolated bubble, but part of a larger movement for justice and equity. He reached out to local leaders, educators, and even a few representatives from the police department. They agreed to participate, eager to engage in the dialogue. Daryl was filled with a sense of purpose as he organized the event, determined to create a safe space for conversation. The night of the town hall, Daryl stood before a packed audience once again. He could see both familiar and new faces, those who had supported him and those who were still skeptical. He felt a mix of excitement and nerves. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began. "We're here to discuss the issues facing our community and how they relate to the broader conversation happening across the country. I believe it's crucial for us to recognize our role in this dialogue." Daryl shared statistics about racial disparities in policing and education, illustrating how these issues permeated even their small town. "We may think these problems don't affect us directly, but they do. We are all part of a larger fabric, and it's our responsibility to ensure that every thread is valued and supported." As he spoke, he noticed nods of agreement from some sections of the audience, while others remained apprehensive. Daryl understood that the conversation would not be easy, but he was determined to keep pushing forward. As the discussion unfolded, people began to share their experiences, stories of fear, prejudice, and hope. The walls began to dissolve as empathy filled the room. Even those who had been critical of Daryl found themselves engaging in meaningful conversations. One man stood up, his voice shaking. "I've always thought of myself as a good person, but I realize now that I've been blind to the struggles of others. I didn't want to see the issues because I was afraid of what it might mean for me. But I want to learn." The vulnerability in his words resonated with many. Daryl felt a swell of hope. That's the first step, recognizing that we all have room to grow. We're not here to point fingers. We're here to learn and support one another. As the town hall progressed, it became clear that the conversation was shifting. More residents began to express their commitment to change, pledging to educate themselves and engage with their neighbors. Daryl felt a sense of gratitude as he witnessed the power of community. By the end of the evening, Daryl felt exhausted but fulfilled. The conversations had been challenging, but they had also been transformative. As people filed out of the community center, many stayed to discuss their thoughts with one another, and Daryl knew that they had taken another significant step toward healing. Over the next few weeks, Daryl continued to see the impact of their discussions. Residents began to reach out to one another, forming groups dedicated to learning about different cultures, histories, and experiences. The momentum of change was palpable, and Daryl felt invigorated by the progress they were making. However, with the rise of engagement came the realization that not everyone was willing to accept this shift. Daryl received more anonymous letters, some filled with anger and resentment. "You're ruining our town," one read. "We don't need your kind of change." Each letter stung, but Daryl reminded himself of the reasons he started this journey. He refused to let fear and hatred deter him from his mission. Instead, he used the negativity as motivation to push harder, to continue advocating for understanding and empathy. One evening, as he sat in his garage, he reflected on his journey. He thought about the accident that had changed everything. The day he had rushed into the flames to save Officer Bradley. That moment had set him on a path he never anticipated, but it had also opened his eyes to the potential for transformation. As Daryl sat with his thoughts, he received a call from Officer Bradley. "Hey, Daryl, I just wanted to check in and see how everything's going." Daryl smiled, grateful for the connection they had formed. "It's going well. We've had some tough conversations, but I can feel the shift in the community. More people are getting involved, and it feels like we're moving in the right direction." "I'm proud of you," Bradley replied. "You've really stepped up, and I've seen the difference it's making. But I also know it's not easy." Daryl nodded, even though Bradley couldn't see him. "It's definitely been a challenge, but I believe in what we're doing. We can't give up on our community." They continued to discuss the challenges and triumphs they had encountered. As they spoke, Daryl felt a sense of solidarity with Bradley, a connection forged through adversity and mutual respect. As spring approached, the Bridges of Hope initiative planned a community event to celebrate their progress. Daryl envisioned a gathering that would showcase the diverse cultures within Riverton. A day filled with food, music, and stories from different backgrounds. On the day of the event, the park was alive with color and energy. Flags representing various cultures fluttered in the breeze, and the scent of delicious food wafted through the air. Daryl watched as families set up their booths, sharing their heritage with the community. As the festivities began, Daryl felt a sense of pride wash over him. This was what he had envisioned, a celebration of unity amidst diversity. He moved from booth to booth, engaging with residents and learning about their traditions. Later in the afternoon, Daryl took the stage to address the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today to celebrate the richness of our community. It's incredible to see so many faces, all different yet connected by our shared love for Riverton." He highlighted the importance of understanding and appreciating one another, emphasizing that their differences were what made the community strong. "Together, we can create a future where every person feels valued, where we support one another, and where we learn from each other's stories." As he spoke, he could see the energy in the crowd, a mix of excitement and hope. Daryl felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that they were on the right path. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the park, Daryl watched families dance, laugh, and connect. The event had brought the community together in ways he had only dreamed of. People were mingling, sharing stories, and finding common ground. But as the evening wore on, Daryl also felt a sense of vigilance. He knew that while they had made significant strides, the journey was far from over. He remained committed to continuing the work of building bridges and fostering understanding. The next day, Daryl received a phone call that would change the course of his efforts. A local news station wanted to interview him about the Bridges of Hope initiative. They were interested in showcasing the community's journey and highlighting the progress they had made. Daryl felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. This was an opportunity to amplify their message, but he also knew that it would bring more attention and scrutiny to their efforts. He discussed it with his team, and they agreed to move forward, eager to share their story with a broader audience. As the news segment aired, Daryl felt a sense of pride watching the coverage. The footage showcased the Unity Day, the diverse cultural event, and the heartfelt conversations taking place in Riverton. They highlighted the importance of empathy, understanding, and the commitment to creating a better future. However, with the increased attention came new challenges. Daryl began to receive both support and backlash from the community and beyond. While many celebrated the initiative, others voiced their opposition, accusing him of trying to create division.